Central Florida, you're listening to the most electrifying show in media. A Neighbor's Choice. I'm your host, your neighbor, David Gornoski. So glad to be back with you for another journey through the news and headlines of our time. We're rolling up our sleeves and solving problems neighbor to neighbor, which means we're not going to rely on the same old toxic framework, the same old narratives that we pick up from the old media. We're going to look at things with fresh eyes, with hearts fully resonating towards the truth. And it's an exciting time to learn, as so many different institutions are completely unraveling before us with their lies, just so overwhelmingly not able to maintain their structure. So many false promises, so many failed mandates can only sustain for so long before they fall apart and unravel. And that's why it's important for us to have actual historical role models for us to anchor and imitate in history, to know the right mindset and actions and state of being that we should have in facing life. I saw there's a little bit of a lunchroom drama, so to speak, about some of the things Jordan Peterson, the psychologist from Canada, has said recently. And I interviewed Jordan Peterson years ago. I had a great conversation with him at the day of his book release, 12 Rules for Life, in New York City. We did a video, and we did an article. It went on to various media outlets. And in the interview, I was trying to show him how his psychological assessment of using Jesus as an archetype, as the greatest myth of all myths, so to speak, to psychologically orient our life, had value, but ultimately could be fulfilled with an anthropological reading of the biblical text, which would put us much more closer to actually recognizing Jesus as a historical figure who changed the physical world and changed historical reality itself, including our current events, and that by imitating his nonviolent way, we could solve tyranny and solve relational dysfunctions and all of the constant tit-for-tat reciprocal conflicts. But he's recently gotten into some pushback because of his recent comments on his podcast, in which he said that it would be a good thing for Americans to call their member of Congress and demand some kind of action with regime change for Iran because of the tyrant's behavior towards the women they're suppressing there. And I think this reveals the deficiency of having a psychological view of Jesus that isn't anchored in the historical, actual life living example that Jesus gave in history. Because if we had that in mind, we would understand that when globalists want to sell people on a terrible idea like deciding who should rule a country far, far away by force and chaos is what would happen, they have to sell that narrative to Westerners impacted by Christianity and the Bible by presenting pictures of victims to appeal to our concern for victims and misfits and the underdogs and the marginalized and the oppressed. And so if we have an anthropological perspective of Jesus, we won't be caught up in kind of abstract, disembodied notions of Jesus. Jordan Peterson talks about God being the ultimate pointing, the ultimate orientation towards good, but it gets very kind of messy when you keep it disembodied like that as something of the mind. Jesus was incarnational truth, action truth, and Jordan Peterson talks about that sometimes, but it's kind of an addendum, it's kind of an add-on to the fundamental psychological approach to looking at the biblical text. And when you do that, you don't realize how the Gospels undermine mythology while still having some common threads in some of the dying and rising motifs and some of the lessons that other religions before Christianity grasped at partial bits of truth and virtue here and there, pointing us towards the incarnational personhood revolution of Jesus and the end of sacrifice that he inaugurated on the cross. Nevertheless, by just trying to flatten it out as a psychological experience of archetypes of our subconscious, like Carl Jung, the psychologist that has impacted Jordan Peterson's ideas the most, I would say, you end up with errors in how to actually incarnate imitating Jesus. You don't know, wait a second, what's my hermeneutic of suspicion that I should have when I hear the television and all these giant corporations piping in selective imagery of victimization in a far-off country and then asking for people to send their treasure and their children possibly to risk nuclear or potential world war over installing somebody else in some far-off country we don't understand the culture. When you have that kind of hermeneutic approach to suspicion to the narratives of powerful media conglomerates and political forces, you can be much, much more able to detect BS when you see it. You can say, you know what, I think that those women and the exploitations that those seem bad, and there's a lot of tyranny, but there's a lot of tyranny in many other countries. And the way you deal with tyranny is not by saying, we'll be God and we will overthrow that leadership, because when you do that, you might get a more stronger right-wing, reactionary, authoritarian replacement in place of the current leadership in Iran. Or you might get something else which is completely corrupt in a different way. Or you might get factionalism, chaos, destruction of infrastructure, loss of food, economic poverty, calamity for people, untreated diseases, malnourishment with food supplies disrupted, absolute hell and chaos. So what you're saying is, remember that saying where he talked to the TV reporter, Kathy Newman, I think, or whatever her name was, where she'd say, so what you're saying is, well, actually here, I think we can actually say that with good faith. And the point is, if you're telling people to go write their congressperson to go and sell them on getting the government to do more to overthrow the government of Iran, you're saying it's okay to sacrifice X amount of innocent people around the world that you know nothing about their cultural perspective. You don't understand what their values are. You don't understand the local dynamics of factions and feuds and rivalries and economic factors and mafia groups within any kind of government. You don't understand any of that. You just see a TV, you get emotional, you feel like you have a right to change the world by force, and that if that includes sacrificing many innocent lives, possibly millions of people, then so be it, because your righteous cause of using force to change the world does not have any brakes, does not have any curb. Well, first of all, that's completely contrary to the founders. The founding spirit of John Quincy Adams is completely opposed to the spirit that Jordan Peterson is operating from when he says that we should demand Congress to initiate regime change in Iran. He doesn't understand the American system and the spirit by which it was created to not have a government that goes off in search of monsters to destroy, but to be the well-wisher of liberty, to be neutral, to be a beacon of liberty. We are not any of those things. So if we wanted to get Iran to get liberty, we should have been embodying that liberty here at home for generations. We shouldn't have had the Patriot Act. We shouldn't have had NSA surveillance. We shouldn't have had the Department of Education. We shouldn't have psychological operations being waged on the American people to get them to take experimental products that harm them desperately and viciously. We shouldn't have had all these lies about economics, like buying a house that'll never go down in value just to make money for the banksters. We shouldn't have had the lies of the drug war, the war on poverty. We shouldn't have had lies about the FDA and what is considered to be good and healthy medicine and how to treat the human body. That's how you spread liberty, by not doing all the things we've been doing domestically. Embracing liberty, embracing nonviolence, embracing diversity of ideas, embracing decentralized sense-making networks, aka markets, allowing that to be the role model that inspires people. Instead, our actions that overthrew the Shah is what allowed the current regime in Iran to have the power they've had over the years, and our chaos that we've sowed around the Middle East has done a lot to entrench the powerful, government in Iran even further than it would have been if we had not had such a reckless foreign policy that Iranians' government could say, hey, look, you don't like the way we do domestic politics, but look at what the governments that work with America go through. Look at the regime change they do. Look at the chaos they unleash. You want that over here? And they say, no, I think I'll stick with what we have rather than risk revolutionary chaos, absolute destruction like so many countries have experienced in the last few centuries, last few decades in American foreign policy in the Middle East. So all of this you can understand when we have an incarnational anthropology simply meaning the study of man and how humankind came to be culturally and how it makes sense of itself or as a species and its stories and its culture and its societies. If you look at the Bible and look at the story of Jesus with that framework as opposed to this, Jungian, Carl Jung psychology perspective, you get more action-based, hard examples of how to think about myths of our time, because Jesus was able to discern the lies and hypocrisy of his myths of his time, including the gods of the city who demanded this kind of hubristic, sacrificial logic that said we are better and we deserve to have wrath poured on our enemies. Well, Jordan Peterson's falling into that same mistake because he's not anchored to an incarnational, embodied perspective of imitating Jesus that has certain implications for how you approach the world when you actually imitate Jesus's approach to looking at the world, as opposed to psychologizing it into a disembodied, abstraction. Because once you abstract it, you can make it justify any kind of moral crusade that the powerful oligarchs of our time are able to do. They're able to take archetypal heroes' quests, themes, and symbols like Carl Jung and Jordan Peterson talk about and play on our emotions to get us sold on destructive wars of regime change and chaos and a bunch of other nonsense that we're seeing play out. So it's important for us to understand, an anthropology of the gospel, not a psychology alone. I think that helps people understand things in a much more fresh and clear and crisp and simple way. Cernovich, the commentator online, Mike Cernovich, says, I'm not polite to people advocating for regime change in the Middle East or anywhere, especially when they aren't even American but want America to do something. Cry more. He's one of the guys pushing back against that line of thought. Because Jordan Peterson has, gotten a lot of currency with folks, and for him to make fundamental mistakes like this, and this isn't the first time. And look, he can believe what he wants to believe. But the point is, when you represent, I'm the guy that can help you understand the archetypes of Christ, okay, well, true. That's going to misdirect people in the wrong direction, that in an anti-Christ way, when we're off to go off with regime change. Another quote from Jordan Peterson that Dave Smith, the comedian, shared says, Jordan Peterson did a podcast telling his American audience to tell Americans Congress to take action on Iran. Suddenly he's not above political activism, but Christopher Rufo wants education cleaned up, and gosh, that's way too complicated and messy, unlike regime change in Iran. See, when you have this kind of moral do-gooder vibe where, that tyranny, let's use our tyranny to overthrow that, and then that'll just be fine. That's a simplistic, cartoonish, lie-based version of the world. Jesus said God desires mercy, not sacrifice. He doesn't say God desires mercy for the Iranian people through the sacrifice of millions of their innocents by some kind of oligarchic regime change that we impose on them. You see how clean this is? This is not for debate. I mean, we can debate it, but it's not a very hard thing to ascertain if you actually look at Jesus' life instead of turning it into, it's a symbol of how we die and resurrect from a bad job or a bad situation. I mean, you can take those little themes out of there. That's fine. I'm not going to be turning my nose on that if that helps people, but it's got to go further than that. There are real, actual implications by some of the things that Jesus unleashed in history. All of the things that he unleashed in history, namely his life and his action. Why do the nations rage in vain? Because Jesus dismantled the heart of their systems, which is the use of sacrifice, that some should be murdered or killed or excluded for the power of the many to be maintained. That is garbage in the Christian world that we're living in. That is not possible. It can't work. Because, like I said, you're not going to be able to create order through some kind of regime change overthrow. It will create backlash. It will create schism. It will create chaos, sectarianism, and disarray. So important that we understand what it means to actually follow the personhood example of Jesus' life in our current events that we see today. Cernovich said also, Jordan Peterson opens his Joe Rogan appearance taking shots at Christopher Rufo, who with nonsense like, Rufo better be careful or the left might use his tactics. What? The left is showing porn to kids. Whenever conservatives take action, these Pied Pipers show their true selves. Now, I'm not going to go so far to call a Peterson a Pied Piper, okay? I don't want to be some of those guys that want to get, I'm going to call names or something, try to get clicks or downloads. I'm just trying to give you an honest assessment of why someone as smart as Jordan Peterson can make mistakes when he operates from the wrong foundation of how to look at Jesus. That's more important to me because I want to learn lessons from situations, not just take name calling or labels or something. And the lesson here is we got to get the anthropology of the gospel right. Now, this point here, I don't know the context of this, so I'm not going to comment too much, but this is about his appearance on Rogan. They're saying, and Christopher Rufo is the guy who does a lot of the expose of the critical race theory and different things taught in schools today. And he's summarizing Peterson's approach to, Rufo better be careful or the left might use his tactics. And they're saying, Will Chamberlain, another conservative guy, says Jordan Peterson really does need to get a grip here. The left is already using all these tactics. Conservative activists like Chris Rufo and others have decided to stop unilaterally disarming. Now, that one is a little more complicated because if we understand anthropology, we know that when you keep mimicking the same aggressive dishonesty or lust for power or coercion or obsession with your rival faction, that it reciprocates in this endless cycle. And so, actually, I agree that I don't know the full context of this, so I'm really kind of just riffing off of just the bare data that I've just shared here. But I kind of agree with the spirit in some sense of what Peterson's saying in this context, that, you know, be careful what you do because your rival will imitate that. And be careful what you're already doing unconsciously to imitate your rival's behavior already. And will that actually get the results that you want? Having said that, I do think that there's a way to agree also with the critics of this approach of not stooping to this bad tactics approach, because there's a way in which it's used to be, well, we're going to be having decorum and we're going to have this kind of designated loser status, kind of like a Mitt Romney type, you know? Nothing about Mitt Romney is a great example of imitating Jesus, but he's got the old polished up buttoned up perspective. He's got the, I'm just a gentleman vibe, but he's sending people off to war. He's sending people off to debt. He's destroying our currency. He's destroying our national boundaries. He's totally selling out the poor and the middle class. So he's, imitating the left really in their governing policies, but he's not imitating the left in their creative ways of actually winning and moving the agenda forward. And so I think in that spirit, it's good to push back on this frame of, well, we better be careful or the left might use those tactics. You see what I mean? So it's a complicated thing. I think there's a way in which there's a truth to that the old guard, the Lindsey Graham, the John McCain, Mitt Romney, George W. Bush, Nikki Haley, the neocon thing, we're not going to go all ruthless for winning because we're not really motivated by any big principles. We're just here to kind of slow down whatever those crazies are doing and make money for our donors in the process. That's not a winning strategy. You have to have bold, vibrant energy to set the agenda. So I agree with that. And so that's a little bit more nuanced on that point. So we'll continue live on A Neighbor's Choice in just a moment. You can call in at 727-587-1040, 727-587-1040, or email me hello@aneighborschoice.com. Back in just a moment.